So thanks for joining me for this webinar. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate everybody giving your time and energy to me and being willing to give me a little bit of time to help educate you. I firmly believe that when it comes to medicine, knowledge is power. And I think that the way that we've been doing medicine in the past in this country is not to educate people appropriately. The model doesn't work that way. In fact, the model's just the opposite. You go to the doctor has a special education, wears a special uniform, speaks a special language, and you're supposed to rely on that doctor to tell you what to do without really getting good explanations about why or helping you understand why. And I think that actual health and health care will serve us better if we know what's going on with our health, because then we can make better choices for ourselves. And I do firmly believe that the number one killer in this country is not heart disease, it's not cancer, it's actually misinformation. It's not understanding truly. And so tonight, the title of the webinar is How to Live Longer, Trade Secrets That Science Has Taught Us. And so I'm going to go through some basic biochemistry and some newer discoveries in biochemistry and how our bodies work that I believe play a very, very important role in our ability to control our health and ultimately to live longer. Now, I find this stuff tremendously interesting. Then again, I'm kind of a biochemistry nerd. Maybe those of you who have joined me on these webinars regularly are becoming biochemistry nerds as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So number one, I have a question for you. What is the true potential for human lifespan? How long can we actually live? Well, I'll tell you that in the 1600s, the average lifespan was about 30 years. In 1998, any guesses? Average lifespan is up to 76 years. Now, I have to say that this is largely due not to our health care and our understanding of how the body works. It is much more up to or due to improvements in sanitation and water, the advent of antibiotics, refrigeration. The truth is that many, many, many less babies die either in childbirth or in that first year of life today than they did 300 or 400 years ago. And that is largely responsible for that average lifespan expanding. But what is our maximum? And I've seen many, many different answers to this question. To me, the most reasonable estimate, based on understanding how our body works and how our bodies are designed to work, is that we probably should have the ability to live 120 to 140 years. Now, for me, there's a little bit of a dilemma here because in medicine, we may strive to actually meet that potential, but I think we lose sight of quantity versus quality. And I know many people struggle with and suffer with living longer with a very poor quality of life. And so I just sort of throw that out there for something to think about as well as we go through this discussion, because the truth is that I don't want to live to 120 years if it's machines that are keeping me alive, or I'm not able to be up and about and doing what I want to do and what I'm here to do. If I can only have that sort of quality of life until I'm 80, well, then that's what I want. I believe for myself and for everyone else that we actually do have the potential to live 120 years, 130 years at with fully functioning body, being able to do everything that we want to do. I also want to spend a little bit just talking about nature. So, what does nature really want from us? And it really is a little bit of a cold answer, but it's a little bit I mean, it's absolutely the truth. What nature really wants from us is to procreate. Nature just wants us to be able to further the species. That, from nature's perspective, is our purpose for being here. So, what happens when we are no longer viable to reproduce? Well, unfortunately, nature is really kind of done with us and just wants to fatten us up for the rest of us. And so that's maybe sort of what we see happen when a woman goes through menopause. That's an example of that, because when a woman goes through menopause and she's no longer able to reproduce, what happens? She starts to gain weight. And women who are able to maintain their weight and their health have to sort of fight against that tide. That's just nature kind of being cruel, brutally honest, maybe. I want to mention the significance of insulin levels, and I did a whole webinar about this as well, but I think it's important when we speak about longevity. We've been told that insulin is a hormone, and its job is to basically just tell sugar where to go. Meaning, you eat something, breaks down in your stomach, some of that is sugar that gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and then insulin gets released to help tell that sugar where to go, to escort it into certain kinds of cells, to escort it into glycogen in the muscles and in the liver for to be, for fuel to be used on a short-term basis, and then also to be stored as fat for fuel tomorrow, basically. And it is true that that is a function of insulin, but really insulin's true function is to monitor and take care of our longevity. And again, it goes back to nature and how nature works. And so if there isn't any food available, go back to caveman times. If there wasn't food available, insulin levels would stay low. And that was sort of a signal to nature that the conditions were not prime to reproduce, meaning that if someone were to become pregnant when there wasn't food available, it's less likely that the baby would, one, survive, and two, thrive. And insulin is sort of like the messenger there, insulin levels. And if the opposite was true and food was plenty and insulin levels were elevated, that's a signal to nature that the conditions are perfect to reproduce, and nature would have us reproduce and get on with life. And so every study ever done on any species where you cut down on the number of calories but make sure that there's proper nutrition, the result has been longevity. So if you want to live longer, you want to keep your insulin levels at a lower level. And I believe that this is one of the major issues that we have with chronic disease today, is that we have a grain-based diet, and those grains cause sugar spikes, which cause release of insulin. And that's what leads to all the chronic disease that we have today. And so less calories with optimal nutrition in every species studied equals living longer, anywhere from 40% to 200%, depending on the species that you're talking about. So I want to talk a little bit, I don't know if you've heard this term before, telomeres. And so I'm going to explain what they are and why they're important for us to understand, and why they are such a huge topic of research today in science, in many, many realms, in regular medicine, in nutritional medicine, in understanding, basic biochemistry and human biology. So let's talk about cell replication for a second. I've got a fancy picture here for you to look at. So chromosomes, I don't know if you can see my little pointer, but chromosome, that's this little thing right here in the middle of the cell. This is a chromosome right here, this little X-shaped thing. They're double-stranded strings of DNA in the center of our cells. And so this is sort of just a representation of really what is there. And you can see that it's this double-stranded piece of apparatus, and you've got these little connectors here that are connecting one strand to the other. These are called base pairs, these little things right here. And that's what DNA is. And so a cell reproduces when it will take this strand and break it off so that there's two single strands, and then create what was the match for each side of it. And then you've got two of these double strands, and that's how cells basically reproduce. And at the end of these strands are these little stretches of DNA, which are called telomeres. And what they do is they protect the DNA from the rest of the strand. They protect it from sort of fraying. So the way that you can think of it is the telomeres are kind of like that little end, that little nib on the end of a shoelace that keeps the shoelace from fraying. Because you've experienced this, if that end comes off of the shoelace and those strands start to fray, then you can't use the shoelace anymore. You can't get it in the little eyelet of the shoe or whatever. So that's how cells replicate. And those telomeres are these small protective little strands of DNA on the end of the bigger, longer strand. And understand that's where our genes are in that DNA. When those cells reproduce, that's how we reproduce into ourselves. Okay. There's also this concept of programmed death. And so as a cell reproduces, the telomeres get eaten up each time, usually slowly over time. So there'll be a certain length, and as the cell reproduces, the telomere will become shorter and shorter and shorter. And once this happens, then the cell can't reproduce properly anymore. And ideally, this leads to a kind of death. And this is called programmed death within the cell. So maybe another way to think about the telomere is actually it's sort of like the fuse on a bomb. And every time it replicates, the fuse gets shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually that bomb blows up and then that cell dies. In a chromosome that has 150 million of those base pairs, remember those two things that sort of connect those two strands, a telomere might be made up of, say, 8,000 of those base pairs. So get that, 150 million to 8,000. So obviously the telomere is very, very short compared to the rest of the chromosome. Each time a cell replicates, the chromosome will lose anywhere from 30 to 200 of those base pairs on the telomere, right? So as we age, the length of a telomere may actually go from what I said was 8,000 down to 3,000. When we're elderly, maybe those telomeres have lengths of only 1,500 base pairs. This is really a description of the aging process from a biochemical perspective. And I want to note that some cells in the body actually don't constantly replicate, like heart muscle cells. So their telomeres don't shorten over time, and that's why our heart lasts as long as it does the way it is. All right. So what are the purpose of these telomeres? Well, they are there to protect the DNA material of a cell. They allow for appropriate and accurate reproduction of the cell. When cells reproduce inaccurately, that's one of the things that can cause a cell to have dysfunction, to not work the way it's supposed to. That actually is another way of describing cancer cells potentially. So, what's the relation to aging here? And so, with people over 60 years old that have been studied, those with shorter telomeres are 3 times more likely to die from, say, cardiovascular disease, 8 times more likely to die from infectious disease. And so, really, as telomeres shorten, that really is one of the harbingers of the aging process. And so, there's a lot of research going on right now in regular medicine and in biochemistry to try to understand this process and try to affect this process. Because if we understand this and we can do something to stop telomeres from shortening, maybe we can elongate life. Maybe this is the fountain of youth that we've been looking for all this time. So another term, so we said telomeres, well, this is telomerase. This is an enzyme. And what this enzyme does within cells is to add base pairs back to the end of the telomere. In essence, we're saying it's going to lengthen the telomere. And if we understand aging, we understand that doing that may actually work against aging, right? This enzyme, telomerase, is more prevalent in younger cells. And without it, actually, a species would become extinct very quickly because the telomeres would get shorter and shorter very, very quickly, and then cells would die, and then the organism that those cells are made into would die as well. I also want to point out, though, that this enzyme is abundantly present in egg and sperm cells. That would be obvious why. And I also want to tell you that it's present in cancer cells. And so this may be a bit of a double-edged sword. So in essence, cancer cells are cells that really never get old and die. They sort of forget that they're supposed to get old and die. And so this enzyme, which keeps telomeres lengthened, is abundant in cancer cells, preventing those cancer cells from dying. Now, some cancer treatment research is actually looking into how to inactivate this enzyme, which would then allow those specific cells to, remember to grow old and die, and that means that the cancer would go away. But obviously, again, this can be a double-edged sword because you may actually be interfering with normal function of cells as well. And, we've experienced that in medicine, right? Because that's what chemotherapy does. Chemotherapy in general targets fast-growing cells. And so that's what cancer cells are. But you know what else are fast-growing cells? Immune cells and gut cells and hair cells. And so that's why when you're on chemo, your immune system gets beat up, you get nauseous and vomit, and your hair falls out. All right. So here's a big question for you. Which comes first? Do short telomeres cause aging, or are they merely a sign of aging, sort of like gray hair? And the answer is not completely known or understood yet. And so when we get gray hair when we age, but gray hair doesn't cause aging, right? Researchers have experimented with adding telomerase, that's that enzyme, to cells and found that in the laboratory, they can actually keep human cells living and producing much longer than they're programmed to live. One might question whether those cells would become cancerous, meaning that, oh, wait, if we are putting telomerase into the body, are we potentially causing cancer cells? And at least in laboratory cells, that is not the case. I also want to point out that differences in telomere length and different species don't necessarily match up to our understanding of this. And so if aging process was solely about the length of these telomeres, and again, the telomeres are these protective lengths of DNA at the end of chromosomes. If this was just about the telomeres, then species with the longest telomeres would actually be the species that would live longest, right? But this isn't necessarily the case because humans, we live pretty long as far as the species go. I mean, there are some species on this planet that live longer, like elephants, turtles maybe, but we live pretty long, especially if you would compare our lifespan to a mouse, and yet mice have longer telomeres than humans do. So obviously, there are other factors than just the telomere length that determines lifespan. I just want to also mention some specific health conditions that there are implications about with this discussion, because if we can make certain cells in our body function better or longer or back to the way they were when we were younger, that has some implications for health, like insulin producing cells. And so part of what happens with adult onset diabetes is that the cells that make insulin stop producing insulin the way they're supposed to or the way they used to. And so it's a potential that this sort of treatment and understanding may actually lead to fixing this problem. Or joint cells, I'm talking about arthritis. Or bone cells, I'm talking about osteoporosis. Or muscle cells, and there's all sorts of muscular dystrophy and other muscle dysfunction related conditions as we get older. Skin cells, so if somebody had a burn and their skin cells weren't reproducing the way they should, this has some specific implications for that. And of course, immune cells as well. nerve cells even. So if we're talking about nerve dysfunction conditions like Parkinson's even, this would have some implications for. So then the question becomes, what really causes aging in humans? And so there's four different issues here. One of them is just chronological age. You know, risk factors increase over time as we age. Did you know that? Right now, once a person is over 60, their risk of dying from whatever doubles every 8 years. So you can look at that as us as a society, or you can just look at that as you as an individual. The health that you are when you're 60, regardless of what it is for you as an individual, when you are 68, you are going to be twice as likely to die of whatever cause as you were when you were 60. And when you're 76, you'll be 4 times as likely to die as when you were 60. That just seems like sort of common sense, right? So with chronological aging, there are some genetic factors. And we have these genetic tendencies. Those are sort of our genetic weaknesses. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second when we talk about things that are under our control and how we can actually get our genes to express themselves in the most positive way. And then there's the whole telomere length thing. We talked about that. Hopefully you understand that and that makes sense to you. Remember that those genes are part of the chromosome that gets reproduced. And so telomere length plays a role with the ability to have genes, quote unquote, translated from one cell to another as accurately as possible. And dysfunction and genetic tendency towards things happens quicker or more when cells are not reproducing exact copies of each of themselves. And that happens when this telomere length starts to get shorter. Excuse me, oxidation is a big part of the aging process. And of course, everybody knows about Linus Pauling and the research that he did on an antioxidant called vitamin C and its role in the aging process. And so oxidants are substances that damage DNA, they damage proteins, they damage fats. And oxidants, you can think of oxidation just like you think of rusting. If you have a piece of metal that's outside in the elements in the weather, it starts to rust. That is oxidation. Same thing sort of happens inside our body as well. These oxidants come from exposure to X-rays, exposure to sunlight. They come from exposure to chemicals and that kind of stuff. The biggest source of oxidation and oxidants in the body is actually just normal biochemistry. Your body creates oxidants as a waste product or as part of a waste product of just normal biochemistry. And so the body has ways of creating antioxidants. These are things that can fight against oxidation. And so we know of antioxidants that are vitamins and minerals, things like vitamin E and vitamin C and selenium and zinc and maybe some of the fancier ones like astaxanthin or coenzyme Q10. Those are all antioxidants that we can get from our diet. The truth is that your liver makes a very, very potent, the most potent antioxidant called glutathione. And that's one of the ways that your body then fights against this waste of the regular process of normal functioning. Now, your body has the ability to create a certain level of antioxidants or antioxidant activity, and your body was not designed to have to deal with all of the pollution that we deal with in our society today, and all of the food additives and all of the smog and what gets into the water. And so it may be that what your liver can produce as an antioxidant isn't enough, and that's why we need to take supplements sometimes. And then the fourth cause of aging is called glycation. And basically, this is the term that describes the binding of sugar to proteins in your body. And that causes dysfunction and mutation of those proteins. And this is why keeping a check on the sugar and your blood sugar is so important to the aging process. I told you about insulin and its role. And then also the sugar is damaging. It's not just fuel, but it's also damaging. And that process is called glycation. So it's a combination of all four of these things that really cause aging in the humans. So, what is it that we can actually control? What is under our control to be able to help make us live longer? That's what this webinar is all about. Recently, a study was done at the University of California, San Francisco, that showed lifestyle choices affect telomere length. That is a huge revelation. This is clear scientific proof of the fact that we do have the ability to influence our genes by our behaviors. For years, I've been saying that what helps determine genetic expression, whether your weaknesses are ever exposed, is how you bathe your genes in your experiences: diet, exercise, lifestyle, coping mechanisms, how you deal with stress. And here is scientific proof that you can actually control the length of your telomeres by your lifestyle, by your habits. And this is really huge, huge implications to the aging process. So, what is actually under control? Number one, our diet. So, I have antioxidants there. And again, we just talked about that and how important that is. And so, getting antioxidants from your diet, very, very important. And maybe supplements as well. Healthy fats, same thing. The glycemic index of food, making sure that the food that you're eating does not cause quick spikes in blood sugar. And you also need the materials to build and repair properly or appropriately. And so that means that you need to get proper protein in your diet, and your body has to have the ability to break those proteins down into those individual amino acids. Those are the building blocks of you. Stress plays a huge role with genetic expression. So I want to talk a little bit about cortisol and cortisol's effect in the body, because it's important to understand. I did a whole webinar about this. If you want to get more detail about this, I'd encourage you to go find that one and listen to it. Cortisol is known as the hormone of stress, and it gets released from your adrenal glands under times of stress. And that process is actually life preserving in the short term. So back when we were cavemen, saber-toothed tiger jumped in the cave, your adrenals kicked out some cortisol, and that caused certain physiological effects to happen. And those physiological effects were designed to allow you to actually survive the encounter with that stressor. So your blood sugar would go up because your body knows that it's going to need extra fuel to fuel running away and repairing from whatever happens from that encounter. Blood is shunted to your muscles, to your brain. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. At that moment, digestion is not really important, and so blood is shunted away from your gut. So short term, that's life preserving. Long term, those things are life altering. All of those changes happening long term are going to be precursors to chronic disease. So what's the big issue with our today is that the saber-toothed tiger in most of our lives never leaves the cave. Back when we were cavemen, either we'd run away or we'd do whatever we have to do to survive that encounter, and then everything would come back to normal and cortisol levels would go back to normal. But that doesn't happen in our lives today. I mentioned hormonal balance there because your body uses progesterone to make cortisol. And progesterone, when it's not in balance with estrogen, causes all sorts of problems. When your progesterone levels go low or your estrogen levels are elevated, it's called estrogen dominance, and that leads to all sorts of hormonal issues, which then affects genetic expression. And then also, I mentioned the genetic expression there. Very important to understand that. If you have a question, don't be shy about punching it right in there for me. Um, Happy to answer those questions for you if I can. So, exercise, also one of those things that we can control. What does it do for us? Well, it helps us use sugar appropriately. We know that. It's instruction to build and repair. You know, when you exercise and you use your muscles, your um, your uh, uh, your body is instructed to make those muscles bigger. I also put exposure to the sun there because vitamin D plays a very big role with genetic expression. And usually, when we're more active, we're outdoors more as well. And so we get more exposure to the sun and sun making vitamin D. I did a whole webinar about vitamin D, and I would encourage you to listen to that as well. And then the last thing I put there is sleep. And this is so, so important. And so it says amount. Now, as we get older, our need for sleep starts to go down a little bit. So when we're babies, we need, 14 or 16 hours of sleep. And then as we're toddlers, we need 12 hours of sleep. And then as we're school children, we may only need 10 hours of sleep. And then as adults, generally we need 6 to 8 hours of sleep. Maybe differ a little bit from person to person, but generally 6 to 8 hours of sleep. But what I put there was also when, because it's not just how much sleep you get, but it's when you get that sleep. It also plays a very big role in the benefit of that sleep. The key time for your body to do regeneration and repair is from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. And for every hour of sleep that you miss between that time, it takes 2 hours to make up. So if you say you get 6 hours of sleep at night and you sleep from midnight until 6 a.m., your body will get more benefit from those same 6 hours if you can sleep from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. All right. So let's talk about supplements for a little bit because I think it's important to understand this. I did a webinar and I do a lot of writing about this idea that I call the essential six. As far as I'm concerned, these are the 6 supplements that every single person, regardless of their health and regardless of their genetic expression, regardless of their genes and what they got from their folks, these 6, either supplements or systems in the body that need support, are key to us living longer. These 6 supplements or systems that need support are key to getting your genes to express themselves in the most positive way. So I would encourage you, I'll go through all 3 of them, all 6 of them real quickly, but I would encourage you to look at the webinar, The Essential 6, because I go into them in much more detail. Vitamin D controls about 2,500 different genes within your body. We used to think that it was really just about the structure in your bones. And of course, the deficiency of vitamin D when we're kids shows up with a disease that's called rickets, where the bones don't develop properly. And we've also discovered that lower levels of vitamin D can contribute to osteoporosis. But as it turns out, as a species, we were not designed to live indoors. Let me say that a different way. For the vast majority of time that we've been on this planet as a species, we have not dwelled indoors. And so we are used to having higher levels of D, which plays a role with our immune system, which plays a role with our cardiovascular system. It plays a role with our structure, it plays a role with our muscles working appropriately. And there are all sorts of studies showing that when you have your vitamin D levels elevated, you're much less likely, much less susceptible to all sorts of diseases of aging. Healthy fats make up every membrane of every cell in your body. So what comes in and out of a cell and how cells communicate with each other, that only happens when healthy fats are incorporated into the cell membranes appropriately. And we have been tricked. This is that misinformation thing. We have been duped into thinking that we should be on low-fat diets. And it's just not the case. We should be on a healthy fat diet. And so supplementing with fish oil is very, very important. Third one there is probiotics. That's the good bacteria in your gut. And when there's an imbalance of that good bacteria, immune function doesn't work right, digestion doesn't work right, elimination doesn't work right, toxins can build up and get absorbed in your system. Interestingly, there's actually more neurotransmitter activity in your gut than there is in your brain. And when there's an imbalance of things in your gut, it affects brain chemistry as well. So, depression, anxiety, sleep, uh, mood, energy, all those things are affected by the good bacteria that's in your gut. The fourth thing there says digestive enzymes, and that's because, for the most part, the food that we eat does not have enzymes in it anymore. Food in nature has the enzymes in it to break itself down. That's why if you take a piece of food and you leave it out, it'll start to go bad. Part of that process is the enzymes that are in that food breaking it down. But when we process food, when we cook food, when we microwave food, when we consume carbonated beverages, that kills the enzymes that are in those foods. And so, taking a plant based digestive enzyme, actually replenishing your diet with the enzymes, two things. It makes you be able to digest that food more completely, so you get more benefit from that food. And number two, it lets liver and pancreas not have to work so hard on digestion so they can work on some of the other things that they're supposed to in the body as well. Fifth thing there says anti-inflammatory herbs. Inflammation is one of the key underpinnings to chronic disease. And so anti-inflammatory herbs like ginger, turmeric, boswellia, rosemary, there's a whole bunch of different ones that can help keep the level of inflammation in your body down, which then allows your body to function properly. Inflammation is a signal that something is not right and the body is going to try to fix it. And oftentimes, in trying to fix it, it causes the things that we call chronic disease. A simple example of this would be allergies. So, an allergic reaction is nothing more than an overzealous inflammatory response. And when that happens, the body, in responding to that inflammation, releases histamine. And that histamine then causes all of the symptoms that we know to go along with allergies, whether that's on the skin where you get rashes and hives, or whether that's in your sinuses where you get, a runny nose, or you get a cough, or you get sniffles, or you get a sneeze, whatever. So that's an example of how the response to the inflammation actually leads to symptoms. So anti-inflammatory herbs, very, very important. And the last thing there is adrenal support. You heard me talk about stress and how stress plays such a vital role with genes expressing themselves in the negative versus the positive, and all of the negative effects of long-term cortisol. That doing some adrenal support with herbs that are known as adaptogens can help calm the adrenal response to stress, can help make it so that you can repair from the stress of stress, basically. It's a good way to put it. So, anyways, that's the Essential Six. That's the Reader's Digest condensed version. And like I said, I would encourage you to go to that specific webinar for more information about those. And then there's some specialty supplements, and I wanted to talk about these as well because you will hear, if you haven't already, that these are anti-aging supplements, that these are nutrients that can play a role with helping you live longer. And it may or may not be true, depending. I hope you've gotten the idea from me already that there's no such thing as a golden bullet or a magic bullet to make you live longer. We've been looking for that fountain of youth for a long time and we haven't found it yet. You know why? Because it's not as simple as, okay, I'm just going to go drink some water or I'm going to go take a pill. The first thing on there is TA65, and I would encourage you to do a Google search for this product and learn about it. It's very interesting, and it's supposedly a specific supplement that will lengthen your telomeres. Now, it's made up of an extract of an herb that's called astragalus. It is ungodly expensive. I think that if you take this the way that they recommend it, a year's supply of this supplement would be $14,000. So I'm a little skeptical about that. I'm also skeptical about the science that shows that it lengthens telomeres because I don't know that that's so simple. I put resveratrol there as well. So resveratrol is that ingredient that you've heard of that comes from red grapes. It's in wine. That's why people say, oh, it's healthy for you to drink wine. And what resveratrol does in your body is it sort of mimics or gets your cells to think or to reproduce the conditions of lower caloric intake. Again, I told you that when you lower your calories but make sure you're getting proper nutrition, that equals longevity. That plays a role in cells living longer, in telomeres staying longer for more time, and resveratrol can mimic that situation in your body. There's another supplement or nutrient that comes from grapes and blueberries that's called pterostilbene, which can do the same thing and or make resveratrol more effective at doing that. And so some of the higher quality, quote unquote, anti-aging supplements, the one that we use most in our practice is by a company called Orthomolecular, and it's called resveratrol, has a combination of resveratrol and pterostilbene and some other things as well. There are components of green tea that have been shown to be helpful in in the anti-aging world, in helping with the telomere issue. And our rhodostragalus there as well. That is an herb. As I said, there's one component of it that that TA65 product is made up of. Traditionally, astragalus has been used for centuries, thousands of years actually, as a tonic for aging or as an anti-aging herb. So lots of times you'll see that as a combination or in products that are supposed to help with health. So, anyways, those are the specialty supplements, and that's the story about aging, about living longer, and what science is teaching us. That whole thing about the telomeres is a very exciting field of discovery, and scientists are working day and night to understand it more and to learn how to extend life. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes with scientific discovery comes the idea that, okay, we can shortcut nature and take advantage of this knowledge, when really it just comes back to what our grandmothers told us. Eat your fruits and vegetables, go out in the sun and play, have a bowel movement every day. Our grandmothers were right, and that's the old wisdom that will actually serve us best now. Next month, I'm going to talk about gluten, how and why to live gluten-free, the detrimental effect that gluten can have in the body, why it is that many of us are walking around with gluten sensitivity without knowing it, why it is that many of us would actually test negative for gluten sensitivity and yet would benefit from getting off of gluten. So that'll be in December. And again, I also want to point out that we have archives of all the past webinars that we've done. This one will be on the archive by Monday or Tuesday. All sorts of topics. I went and looked at them the other day, and there's like, I don't know, 25 or 30 of them now. Lots of different topics. It's very interesting, and so I would refer you to them for background or for new learning, and also to share with friends and family. Everybody, thanks so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Again, I honor your willingness to spend some of your valuable time with me. Hopefully you found it beneficial. Please give me some feedback. If there are topics that you'd like to see me cover in this venue, please let me know about that as well. Everybody, have a great evening.